Somewhere in a forest, long before humans existed in anything like their current form, a group of primates found a pile of overripe fruit lying on the ground. The fruit had started to rot. Sugars inside it had already begun turning into something else, something that smelled sharp and strange, and instead of walking away, they ate it anyway. That single moment, repeated across millions of years and countless species, might be where our entire relationship with alcohol actually begins. Not with a recipe, not with a brewer, with rotting fruit on a forest floor and a nervous system that didn't mind the smell nearly as much as it should have. So here's the real question this video is built around. When did humans actually start drinking alcohol on purpose? Not stumbling into it by accident, but choosing it, making it, and passing that knowledge down. And the answer takes us back much, much further than most people expect. Let's start with the biology, because it explains almost everything that comes after. Ethanol, the alcohol found in fermented drinks, is a natural byproduct of yeast breaking down sugar. Any fruit left sitting on the ground long enough will start to ferment on its own, no human involvement required. This has been happening in forests for tens of millions of years, long before primates even existed in their modern form. And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Researchers studying primate genetics discovered something called the drunken monkey hypothesis. It turns out that a specific gene mutation found in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas dramatically increased our ability to metabolize ethanol. This mutation appeared roughly 10 million years ago. Before it, our ancestors could barely process alcohol at all. After it, they suddenly could break it down about 40 times faster. Why would evolution favor that? Because our ancestors were spending a lot of time on the forest floor, eating fallen fruit that had already started fermenting. The individuals who could process that alcohol without getting sick, without losing coordination, without wasting the calories, had a real survival advantage. They could eat food that others couldn't safely digest. Alcohol tolerance wasn't a party trick, it was a survival skill. So by the time actual humans show up in the story, we weren't encountering alcohol for the first time. We had been quietly evolving alongside it for millions of years already. Our bodies were built for it before our minds ever thought to make it on purpose. Now let's fast forward to the part of the story where things become intentional, because eating fermented fruit off the ground is one thing. Deliberately creating alcohol, storing it, and drinking it as a choice is something else entirely. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional alcohol production comes from a site called Jiahu in Hainan Province, China. Archaeologists analyzing pottery residue found there discovered chemical traces of a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. The site dates back roughly 9,000 years to around 7,000 BCE. This wasn't an accident preserved in the ground. It was a fermented drink made deliberately, stored in containers, and consumed as part of daily or ceremonial life. Think about what that actually means. 9,000 years ago, humans in ancient China had already figured out how to combine multiple ingredients, control fermentation, and produce something drinkable on purpose. That's not a lucky discovery. That's applied knowledge, refined enough to repeat. But here's the same problem we run into with almost every question about prehistoric behavior. The oldest confirmed evidence isn't necessarily the oldest actual instance. It's just the oldest instance that happened to survive in a form we could detect. Alcohol residue is incredibly hard to preserve. It requires the right kind of container, the right burial conditions, and, frankly, a lot of luck. A fermented drink made in a wooden bowl or a woven basket, or simply consumed straight from a container that later rotted away completely, would leave no trace at all. So the 9,000-year mark from Jiahu isn't necessarily the beginning. It's just the earliest point where the evidence happened to line up. This is where a genuinely interesting theory comes into play, one that has quietly reshaped how some archaeologists think about the origins of civilization itself. It's called the beer before bread hypothesis. For a long time, the standard story of agriculture went like this. Humans domesticated wild grains because they wanted a reliable source of bread. Farming led to bread led to settled life led to civilization. Simple, linear, logical. But some researchers looked at early Neolithic sites and noticed something strange. In several locations, there was stronger and earlier evidence of grain being used for fermented beverages than for bread. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, one of the oldest known ceremonial gathering sites in the world, dating back roughly 11,500 years, show large stone vats that some researchers believe were used for large-scale beer production tied to feasting and ritual gatherings long before anyone was reliably baking bread in that region. If that theory holds up, it flips the entire traditional narrative on its head. Humans may not have domesticated grain purely to survive. They may have domesticated it, at least in part, to get people drunk together at large communal gatherings. Bread might have been the practical byproduct. Beer might have been the actual point. That raises a genuinely wild possibility. What if alcohol, not agriculture in the practical sense, was one of the forces that pulled early humans out of small hunter-gatherer bands into larger, settled communities?
Let's sit with that idea for a second, because it's a bigger claim than it sounds like at first. Building large stone structures like Göbekli Tepe wasn't easy. It required organizing dozens, maybe hundreds of people, feeding them and getting them to cooperate on a massive shared project long before anyone had permanent farms or stored grain surpluses. Something had to motivate that kind of large-scale gathering and cooperation. And feasts, built around shared food and shared drink, are one of the strongest tools humans have ever had for pulling large groups together. Shared drinking does something specific to a group that ordinary eating doesn't quite replicate. It lowers social barriers. It loosens the usual caution people carry around strangers. Modern research on alcohol and social behavior consistently shows that shared intoxication increases feelings of closeness, trust, and bonding between people, even people who had no prior relationship. Now, imagine that effect at the scale of an entire early agricultural community, using it deliberately to hold a group together long enough to build something as massive as a temple complex. This is where the beer before bread hypothesis gets genuinely persuasive. If a community wanted to gather large numbers of people, keep them cooperative, and build shared identity and trust fast, alcohol may have been one of the most effective tools available. Grain wasn't just calories, it was a fermentable resource that could turn a scattered group of foragers into a bonded, cooperative community. Now, here's a detail that most people never hear, and it completely changes how we think about who actually gets credit for inventing alcohol in the first place. In nearly every ancient society we have decent records for, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to early China, brewing wasn't a male-dominated craft. It was almost universally the domain of women. In ancient Sumer, beer brewing was directly associated with Ninkasi, a goddess, and the surviving hymn dedicated to her essentially functions as one of the oldest known beer recipes in human history, written down roughly 4,000 years ago. Women in Sumerian society brewed the beer, sold the beer, and were often the ones running the taverns where it was consumed. In ancient Egypt, the situation was strikingly similar. Beer wasn't a luxury item, it was a dietary staple, safer to drink than untreated water in many settlements, and brewed daily in massive quantities. Egyptian tomb paintings repeatedly show women actively engaged in the brewing process, grinding grain, managing fermentation, and distributing the finished product. This wasn't a side task, it was skilled, essential labor, and it was largely run by women. Even in early Andean civilizations in South America, women were the primary producers of chicha, a fermented corn beverage that played a central role in ritual, political, and religious life. The production of chicha wasn't casual, it required real technical knowledge, and the women who mastered it held a genuinely important role in their communities. Somewhere along the way, in a lot of cultures, this history got quietly erased or minimized. Brewing eventually shifted toward male-dominated commercial production in many parts of the world, especially as it industrialized. But the deep roots of intentional alcohol production, the actual technical skill of it, were built and refined largely by women for thousands of years across multiple unrelated civilizations that never had contact with each other. Let's talk about something else that rarely gets mentioned. For most of human history, alcohol wasn't primarily about getting drunk, it was about survival. In many ancient cities, water sources were genuinely dangerous, contaminated with waste, bacteria, and disease, especially in dense settlements without modern sanitation. Beer, because of the fermentation process, was often safer to drink than the water available in the same location. The alcohol content, combined with the boiling involved in production, killed off many of the pathogens that made raw water risky. This wasn't a minor detail. In some ancient societies, beer functioned as a basic dietary staple, providing calories, nutrients, and hydration that was actually safer than the alternative. Egyptian laborers were sometimes partially paid in beer rations, not as a luxury perk, but because it was considered a legitimate, practical part of daily sustenance. So for a huge stretch of human history, choosing to drink a mildly alcoholic beverage over plain water wasn't really a choice about pleasure. It was often the smarter, safer option, and people who instinctively preferred it may have had a genuine survival advantage over those who didn't. This brings us to a question worth sitting with. If alcohol tolerance was already built into our biology millions of years before agriculture, and if fermented beverages were safer than water in many ancient settlements, and if brewing itself may have helped hold early communities together long enough to build the first permanent structures in human history, then alcohol isn't really a side note in the story of civilization. It might be one of the actual load-bearing pillars underneath it.
Once alcohol became something humans could deliberately produce, it didn't stay confined to nutrition and survival for long. It moved quickly into something much bigger: religion, politics, and power. Across nearly every major ancient civilization, alcohol shows up woven directly into religious and ceremonial life, not as an afterthought, but as something central. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was offered to the gods as part of formal temple rituals, poured out as libations meant to honor deities and secure their favor. In ancient Egypt, wine was closely tied to the worship of Osiris, god of the afterlife, and was buried alongside pharaohs specifically so they would have it in the next world. Whoever designed these belief systems clearly didn't see alcohol as something separate from the sacred. They saw it as a direct line to it. The ancient Greeks took this even further, building an entire god around it. Dionysus wasn't a minor figure in Greek religion. He represented wine, ecstasy, ritual madness, and the deliberate loss of ordinary control. Greek religious festivals built around him, the Dionysia, involved organized public drinking as a form of religious devotion, not disgrace. Losing yourself briefly to wine wasn't shameful. In the right context, it was considered a way of touching something larger than yourself. This pattern repeats itself across the ancient world with remarkable consistency. In ancient China, ritual wine vessels dating back over 3,000 years were used specifically in ceremonies honoring ancestors, treated as sacred objects, not casual drinkware. In Vedic India, a ritual drink called soma, its exact ingredients still debated by historians today, was described in religious texts as something that connected worshippers directly to the divine. Different continents, different centuries, different ingredients entirely, yet the same underlying idea kept appearing again and again. Alcohol as a bridge between the ordinary human world and something bigger than it. But alongside all of that sacred, ceremonial use, there's a second, much messier thread running through this same history. Because the moment alcohol became something that could be produced reliably, stored, and traded, it also became something that could be controlled, taxed, and eventually weaponized. Ancient governments figured out early that alcohol production was worth regulating. In ancient Egypt, temple breweries operated at a massive scale, partly for religious use, but also as an organized economic system tied directly to labor and payment. In ancient Rome, wine production became a genuine engine of commerce, with entire regions built economically around vineyards, and wine quality itself becoming a marker of social status and wealth. And wherever alcohol became tied to trade, colonization, and power, its darker uses followed close behind. European colonizers repeatedly used alcohol as a deliberate tool of exploitation, introducing it strategically into indigenous trade relationships in ways specifically designed to create dependency and destabilize communities, from North America to parts of Africa and the Pacific. What had been, in its origins, a shared ritual tool for bonding and survival, became, in the hands of colonial powers, something engineered for control. This is the same pattern this whole story keeps circling back to. a behavior rooted deep in our biology, refined over millions of years, turned into something sacred by early civilizations, and then, eventually, turned into a commercial and sometimes exploitative product by whoever figured out how to scale it and profit from it. So, when did humans actually start drinking alcohol? If we're talking about the earliest confirmed intentional production, the answer is at least 9,000 years, back to the fermented rice and honey drink found at Jiahu in ancient China. If we're talking about large-scale communal brewing tied to ritual gathering, the answer may stretch back over 11,000 years, to the stone vats at Göbekli Tepe. But if we're talking about our biological relationship with alcohol itself, the actual starting point isn't really human at all. It goes back roughly 10 million years to a genetic mutation in the shared ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, a mutation that let our ancestors safely digest the alcohol found in overripe, fermenting fruit lying on forest floors. Long before anyone brewed anything on purpose, our bodies were already adapting to handle it, because the ability to do so meant more food, more calories, and a better chance of survival. What that means is this: by the time any human civilization started writing down laws about alcohol, worshiping gods associated with it, or building economies around it, the underlying behavior and the biology behind it was already unimaginably old, older than agriculture, older than settled cities, possibly older than modern humans as a species. There's something almost humbling in that. For all the ritual, all the religion, all the commerce and control that eventually got built around alcohol, the actual root of it goes back to something remarkably simple: a group of primates on a forest floor millions of years ago who found some rotting fruit and whose bodies, for reasons they could never have understood, were already built to handle what it did to them. Every toast at a wedding, every glass raised at a celebration, every ancient offering poured out to a god, all of it traces back, in some strange roundabout way, to that same forest floor, to fruit that had gone bad, and bodies that, against every expectation, had already learned exactly what to do with it.